إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. Following Hijab's comment on the Londoniya poem and his attempt to justify his systematic incorporation of the Craigian Kalam method with the Salafi practice of da'wah in the West, he proceeds to express his surprise that many Ash'arites have rejected the very idea of using philosophy in Islam, even though they have in fact argued that nazar or philosophical investigation in the existence of the Maker is the first duty of a mukallaf, أول واجبات المكلفين. And of course it makes sense that he should be surprised, because this innovation, which he admits that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah fought rigorously in his books, is a direct logical implication of the very position he is taking towards the so-called Kalam cosmological arguments for the existence of God. Or the Kalam arguments in general, Kalam arguments, okay, even philosophical arguments in more general, in a broader sense, yani. So even if he declares that he agrees with Ibn Taymiyyah in his purely Salafi take on this issue, that another is not indeed a wajib on all mukallafeen, since people do have fitrah that tells them they were indeed created, and that their creator must deserve all the praise that can be given, and to be given it with no partner or equal unto himself. It has to be shown clearly that his very own practice of da'wah and his involvement with kalam, especially within the framework of the methods of Western philosophy, do place him in an implied opposition to that position. He opposes it by implication. Alright? Meaning that you can in fact be a mutakallim in the sense that was fundamentally and unequivocally denounced by the Salaf, when in fact you think you are a Salafi preacher and that you do abide by the manhaj that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, being the Salafi imam that he was, taught and propagated in his books. Just because you agree with him that there is indeed such a thing as fitrah underlying human cognition as a whole, doesn't automatically put you in line with his manhaj rahimahullah and the manhaj of the Salaf. Because you can misquote and misrepresent certain parts of the Imam's text, as I've shown in previous lectures, in a way that places you squarely in the category of a mutakallim, which is, according to the consensus of the Salaf, an innovator, mubtada'. And that's exactly what Hijab does. Okay? We've shown, and we've continued to show بحول wa quwwatihi, that the problem, the fundamental issue that we, Ahlul Hadith, have with mutakallimin is not just in the particular sects of belief they invented for themselves, by which they disfigured many particular beliefs with respect to the attributes and deeds of Allah, and to other major issues as well, like Qadr and Iman and the likes. This is what Ash'ari in particular have strived to fool people into believing, reducing the actual position of the Salaf into a fragment of what it really was. A mutakallim, brothers and sisters, Ash'ari or Maturidi or Mu'tazili or what have you, would typically insist that the Salaf only meant that the innovated doctrines of particular sects of mutakallimin when they attacked kalam and mutakallimin in the general manner that they notoriously did. This is, of course, understandable, since no mutakallim would accept the claim that the Salaf, who were and continue to be the highest reference of deen to all Muslims, have conceded to consider his very method of deducing, arguing for, and presenting the tenets of Islam as an innovation, bid'ah. Okay, it has to be propagated and elaborated that there is nothing wrong with the method itself as he practices it, only with particular doctrines that some mutakallimin have ended up with from using the method itself wrongly and improperly. Okay, this has to be shown. It has to be shown that this is the case. Had they used it properly, they would have no doubt ended up inexorably with the proper doctrine of Kalam, which is what? Oh yes, of course, you named it. The Ash'arite and the Maturidi doctrines, of course. Alright. Now, we don't need to do much to show that this claim is fundamentally false, that it is yet another part of the long-running efforts by mutakallimin from different sects to fool the Muslim lay people into believing that they are the true heirs of the proper Islamic creed, the creed of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, despite the obvious fact that the Sahaba never heard of the theory of substance and essence, or of the principle of theorizing about existence qua existence. Okay, existence as a whole, as at large, okay, as a principle. Okay, the metaphysical principle of theory, that is. And they never They were never engaged with that method of thinking about the world as a whole, the world at large, to think about the entirety of the world, okay, and to try to come up with principles that would lead them into believing that they were in fact created, okay. To think about the world in such a way, or about what's beyond it, okay, that they never did that. Okay, taking that method of thinking or theorization as grounds for believing in the existence of their maker, they never did that. This is a distinct method of theory and argumentation that needs to be shown for the unfortunate Greek innovation, the unfortunate Greek invention that it really is. Okay? It is the reason why Kalam was condemned by the Salaf. Ilm al-Kalam kullu was condemned. Not just the particular false doctrines that this method produced in the sects of Mutakallimin. It's the very fact that those people are addressing these issues the way they are that renders them as innovators, not just the particular outcome of some of their debates and deliberations. Naturally, if you have already been indoctrinated into that method, into that very same method, as is the case with hijab here, you would seek to show that there is nothing wrong with the method itself, and that it is just the fruit of healthy reasoning and rational investigation, nothing more. Okay, it's an advanced mode of thinking that only suits some people and others, while it doesn't suit others. Okay, as he would then proceed to explain. You wish to show, to demonstrate by means of proper reasoning, that there is indeed an unobservable creator to whom you owe your very being, so that you would leave any skeptic convinced. Then that's the way and the method. That's the way you should go. You start from looking at things around you, extrapolating through deduction about all things, and thereby deduce what should or should not exist in reality. It is only sensible that this be the way, right? Well, wrong. Absolutely wrong. That's not the way healthy people should be thinking at all, brothers and sisters. To seek to deduce that I have been created by an entity that deserves all the praise I can give, by proving first that the world at large, given the natures of things that I observe around me in it, was created in its entirety, is by no means a proper way of reasoning or argumentation. It's not the right way to go. Okay, it's a fundamental Greek sophistry to demand that we refute the claim of eternity of this world in order to show that we were indeed created at all. To demand acquiring a general claim about all things, about the natures of all things that can exist in reality, حقائق الموجودات بهذا الإطلاق, so it can be used as premise to prove that a creator really exists, is a methodological sophistry that needs to be shown for what it is. It is nowhere near the proper way of reasoning about the world, much less the divine. The very definition of sophistry that the Greeks have established in their writing suffers from methodological sophistry. Upon closer examination, brothers and sisters, it's not just a plague that occurs in particular forms of propositional argumentation about reality. It also manifests in the very belief that certain claims about reality do require propositional argumentation in the first place, and it would be okay to debate about them, and to have differing opinions on them. Okay, the belief that we need to propose a deductive argument for the fact that we have been created and are being sustained by a being that transcends this world is, and of itself, a sophist, irrational methodological claim that needs to be addressed in a fundamentally different manner, since it exhibits a deep-seated inclination, hawa, that should not be catered to. It should not be catered to. Should not be supplied with more reasons to continue to be there. If you wish to supplant it from its very root, as the Quran teaches us to do. Okay, there is a reason why the Quran relies so heavily on psychological expositions of what is going on inside the hearts of disbelievers. There's a lot of that in the Quran throughout the book, because what's blocking them from accepting what the prophets are teaching is not in fact a lack of knowledge, comprehension, or conviction in the academic sense. No, it's rather the lack of willingness to accept the dictates of the fitrah, or rather, or as is mostly the case, the deep desire not to accept it. The deep desire not to accept it. It is that desire or inclination that disfigures the truth in the eyes of those who claim they are not convinced that they do have a creator, or that he demands to be worshipped alone with no partner. It is the sole reason why leaders of false religions and doctrines would insist on keeping their posts and their social positions despite hearing the Quran and learning about the pure message of Tawheed that it comes with, that it teaches. Because there are socio-psychological reasons why people would insist on holding a scandalously false belief and would go to extreme lengths in rationalizing it to themselves and to the people closer to them. It's not that they no longer have the knowledge of the truth or the reasons to see it as truth inside them, but because they have reasons, they have overarching reasons, superseding reasons, social and psychological reasons, not to see it as truth, as the truth that it is. Okay, this is why it is narrated that Umar radiallahu anhu used to pray saying, Allahumma arina al-haqqa haqqa warzuqna ittiba'ahu wa arina al-batila batilan warzuqna ijtinabahu. Oh Allah, show us the truth as the truth and bless us with submitting to it, and show us the falsity as falsity and bless us with avoiding it. Okay, because our foul desires and bad inclinations could easily blind us, corrupt our hearts, and we could easily fool ourselves into embracing false beliefs and false doctrines, no matter how self-evidently true they may actually be, objectively speaking. This is the aspect of human cognition and belief that the mutakallim systematically fails to address, at least not in the way that the Quran teaches, because to him, everybody who claims not to see the truth is a potential debater who requires propositional argumentation, philosophical arguments, to convince them that there is indeed a merit in the truth. There is indeed epistemic warrant in the truth. Okay? And only when the debate comes to a point where the mutakallim no longer wishes to proceed for social reasons, does he opt to accusing the opponent of insisting or rejecting a position they should no longer have any reasons to reject. In other words, the decision of whether or not someone has hawa, okay, that makes them uphold any given position, is itself determined by the mutakallimin following their own hawa. But the mutakallim in the debate following his own hawa, alright? If there is a social gain to be sought by the mutakallim in taking him as a respectable opponent in an academic debate where he is treated as a seeker of the truth, respected as any theorist or someone who actually has merit in whatever it is that he does, then the entire epistemic status of the subject matter is determined accordingly. The entire epistemic status of the subject matter, and pay attention, brothers and sisters, and what qualifies as rational necessity and what doesn't are all designated as such accordingly, okay, according to that social hawa that moves them. If not, then he is to be ridiculed and treated, and that very same person is to be ridiculed and treated as someone who suffers from hawa and or ignorance without, and of course, denying the necessary and the jahd al-daruriyat yani, without even bothering to debate them at all. Okay? In other words, if a socially weightless individual claims they find no reason to believe they were created at all, they would easily be dismissed as delusional and irrational. Okay? And perhaps subjected to whatever penalty happens to be socially acceptable to cases like his own, with no second thoughts, okay? But if, however, a respectable philosopher in academia makes the exact same declaration, he is to be met with sheer respect and is asked for a debate where he is given merely propositional arguments for the truth, which he would be deemed intellectually credible and potentially justifiable if he chooses to reject them wholesale, okay? And the best that you, the mutakallim, could do then is suggest that perhaps he was wrong and that maybe he should reconsider just in case, okay? Or perhaps other arguments altogether should be suggested to him in another debate or something. Okay, that is, the same subject matter would be treated in one instance as an objectively self-evident fact that someone is to be blamed and even punished if they deliberately rejected it, and in another instance as a mere theoretical suggestion for which an academic philosopher is still striving to come up with sufficiently compelling evidence to establish it against all reasonable opposition and credible doubt. Okay, that's the mutakallim, I mean. In one debate you establish position X and show with deductive premises that anyone who rejects it would suffer from deep contradiction, and in another you would merely attempt to establish one of the main premises you had already used to establish X. Okay, this is the kind of epistemic mess that the Greek tradition has taught to the world, has brought to the world. The one that every mutakallim seeks to fool you into believing is the way of reason and rationality in these issues, the way of those who really wish to have their faiths justified beyond any reasonable doubt. Okay? This bottomless pit of sophistry and metaphysical myth is what a mutakallim would insist that the Salaf should have no problem with, as long as the mutakallim is careful not to dismiss any major tenet of faith in the religion he ascribes to, he declares belonging to, Islam in our case, of course, due to his systematic engagement with it. Okay? Now, what we've sought to show and are still proceeding to demonstrate in our response to Hijab and to others like him in this series and others is that this is nothing but an illusion, brothers and sisters, an elaborate mirage that they keep fooling themselves into believing. It is so because whatever they end up deducing from their arguments, premises, and debates will never amount to anything more than the theoretical proposition. Okay, a philosophical claim that can be rejected by the very same kind of reasons that were proposed for accepting them. Okay, for accepting it. One that they should be willing, by merit of the epistemic status they've already reduced their beliefs to, the status of a theory requiring sufficient argumentation to render it justifiable, to reject and denounce at any given moment in the future, following the debate, whatever it takes them. In other words, if you're a mutakallim, then the kind of faith you should exhibit in any and all of the tenets of your religion is that of potentially refutable, reversible certainty. Okay? Theoretical certainty. You are certain insofar as you find your reasons convincing, and you still have not come across good reasons to convince you otherwise, to sway you to the opposing opinion, to the opposing view. This is definitely not the kind of faith that a Muslim should meet his maker with. A faith that builds upon theoretical skepticism, the position that I know that I'm right now, I am right, I think I'm right, but I also know that I could, in theory and in principle, be wrong. Those who claim to be Salafi and to have studied the athar of the Salaf, radiallahu anhum, and yet they fail to see that this is the fundamental reason why the Salaf condemned the practice of Kalam, should not by any means continue to ascribe themselves to the Salafi tradition or to Ibn Taymiyyah, because they would be upholding the position of the Khalaf rather than the Salaf, brothers and sisters. Okay? It is of utmost importance that we understand this distinction so that charlatans such as Hijab and his ilk wouldn't fool us into a way that the Salaf had condemned, okay, by the name of the Salaf themselves. Right? What they don't understand is that due to this troubled, unstable, relativistic, even epistemic status of rational necessity in the practice of Kalam, no belief is final, not even potentially, as long as the mutakallim continues to do what earns him the distinct title of a mutakallim, or a philosopher, of course. There is no telling what the next debate would bring to the constantly shifting and shuffling components of his belief system. It is so, and yet whatever metaphysical definitions or principles he ends up embracing at any given point ought to be granted the status of rational necessity, only because otherwise he would find himself in the unfortunate position of building his entire religious faith upon grounds that do not justify the certainty that the very concept of faith should entail. Okay. When amongst peer philosophers, he would claim necessity to such definitions and principles only within the limits allowed by the social context of the debate, if at all. When, however, among religious scholars, he would have to pass them as absolute certainties, okay, that cannot be refuted or rejected, قطع العقل, okay, since that's what he would teach as the rational foundation of the core tenet of all faith, the belief in the existence of the Creator himself, the one from which all this has come. Thereby, he would find himself compelled to deal with Scripture using Ar-Razi's rule, also known in the West as the Augustinian rule of Scripture interpretation, forcing innovative interpretations upon Scripture to make them fit with his metaphysical premises and principles, whatever they happen to be at the time, under the fallacious assumption that all inherited interpretations of Scripture are nothing but scholarly opinions, okay? Nothing but ظن, okay? الترجيح ظني أو تفسير ظني, تأويل ظني. Such opinions of scholars of old who did not know the rational necessities, قطعيات العقل يعني, that has now come to be known to him. والله المستعان. This means in effect that the mutakallim is in profound delusion and methodological contradiction, of course, when he claims that he philosophizes or practices philosophy within the bounds, okay, of the basic tenets of his religion and within the framework of the basic tenets of his religion. If those tenets are based on Scripture, and all Scripture is to be interpreted under the condition of not contradicting those proclaimed rational necessities, قطعيات العقل, that he speaks of, okay, that he champions, then obviously no particular tenet is immune to rejection. No particular tenet of your particular religion of Islam is immune to rejection, except of course when there is a social necessity to keep such a tenet in fear of falling victim to accusations of blasphemy, takfir, or innovation, tabdiya, from the religious community in which he wishes to be viewed as a figure of authority. Okay? In that case, some minor manipulation of the metaphysical system itself would have to be proposed in order to accord with that particular belief under a modified conception of rational necessity yet again. One clear historical example of this is the issue of the attribute of speech, صفة الكلام لله عز وجل, and consequently the belief in what the Quran really is. Okay? Under the metaphysics of substance and essence, ميتافيزيقا نظرية الجوهر والعرض, the very meaning of speech as an attribute to an existing entity, any existing entity at all, was to be explained as the emergence of new essences upon the substance. Essences upon the substances, okay? With every new, the instantiation of new essences upon substances. With every new word that is spoken, this is how they would explain the very concept of speech, the very concept of emergence of new words. Okay, new words, new sentences, new phrases come out of any being, just in the way, okay, or in the form of essences coming out on substances. جواهر وأعراض، أعراض على جواهر. The very concept, the very idea of new words or new phrases emerging after they have not been there, of course, coming into being after they haven't been there before, is to be explained according to that theory as essences and substances. Essences happening unto substances, one way or another. All right? According to the theory, of course, according to the metaphysics of the theory. All right? So that's how the theory explains it, and they've all embraced that theory as it's known. All mutakallimin of old have embraced that theory and founded their burhans, their arguments for the existence of Allah upon it. All right. So when Mu'tazilites contemplated on that explanation or definition of what speech really is, that metaphysical theory on the very nature of speech and the very truth of what speech is, okay, it became clear to them that if they were to attribute the maker that they had argued for with premises from that theory, substance and essence itself, to actually speaking with the Quran, to actually having spoken with the Quran, then it should follow that he himself is composed in the fundamental nature of his existence of substances whereon essences would shift and change, resulting in the emergence of speech as we know it, as they would define it. Okay, and since it is blasphemy, kufr, to believe that he is made of anything at all, subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Mu'tazila found they had no choice but to dissociate the maker they ascribed to from the entire meaning of actual speech, okay, of kalam, okay. But if he is not to be described as having spoken with the Quran, then what is the Quran anyway, and where did it come from? Okay, that would become the question then. They found they had no way out of this but to claim the Quran to be a creature of Allah in an innovative doctrine that came to be known as the doctrine of the creation of the Quran, bid'at khalq al-Quran. Now obviously, this is in stark contradiction with what the Quran itself teaches about what it is. The Quran is Allah's own words, spoken by Himself, word by word, lafdhan wa harfan, with His own voice, sawtan, and whoever chooses to believe that it was created the way the speech of creatures was created into them is actually committing blasphemy in contradicting the Quran and what every Muslim believes by religious necessity. معلوم من الدين بالضرورة. Okay, so naturally the Salaf conceded to do takfir of those who held that belief, the belief that the Quran was created as a creature. Now, most of the mutakallimin who came up with that innovation, or that invention, paid little heed to that judgment at the time, and still insisted that the only rationally proper way to understand the Quran in this respect is to reinterpret it to accord with that new belief. They didn't get enough social pressure to reshape their hawa or the hidden inclinations of the hearts and thereby reconsider their position in any way. This, however, was not the case with another group of mutakallimin, al-Asha'ira, who did find social necessity in exhibiting agreement with the scholars of Ahlul Hadith and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahimahullah on this issue. Thus, they sought to invent another Kalami doctrine on the nature of the Quran that has the quality of both not contradicting the metaphysics of the substance and the essences on one hand, since they would not qualify as mutakallimin if they did, and their entire enterprise of proving the existence of their maker would thus collapse. while also at the same time having the quality of aligning with the belief that the Quran is not a creature, since then they would not qualify in the eyes of such scholars whose judgment really mattered to them socially at the time as Muslims. They wouldn't qualify as Muslims in the eyes of those scholars. So what did they do? What did they end up doing? They invented the idea that the Quran must be Allah's speech, as Ahlul Sunnah would insist. However, it must be an eternal attribute of Allah that does not emerge from His self in the form of spoken words. Kalam, it actually, they would call it Kalam Nafsi Qadim. Kalam Nafsi Qadim. Okay, because otherwise they would only be حوادث. الكلمات هتبقى حوادث بقى. تصبح إذن حوادث. Things that happen or come into existence after they were not there. That happen and come into existence after they were not there. Okay? And the theory teaches that the very meaning of happening, al-huduth, is to be explained as nothing other than the occurrence of different essences over the substance. Different essences over the substances. That's the explanation of huduth. That became, according to the Greek metaphysics, a part of what huduth means, of what happening actually means. The word happen, to happen, the word yahduth means that. In this theory, they thought that by inventing that creed, they would win on both fronts and appeal to the two communities simultaneously, both of them, to which they wish to appeal. The community of academic philosophers of the time on one hand, and the community of scholars of Ahl al-Hadith on the other. Okay? And though they did indeed escape the charge of takfir by this doctrine they invented, they didn't escape the charge of major innovation. Okay? One that does, at the end of the day, lead that innovation by implication to the belief that the Quran is nothing but created words. Okay, and eventually, if you think about it, if you contemplate it, you'll find that it actually leads them to the exact same position that they invented that creed to refute or to answer. Okay, to rebuke. Allah never actually spoke with anything, according to the Ash'ara. No words ever came out of Him in the actual common sense meaning of what it is to speak. Okay, to get out words in speech. All right. Rather, He had the Quran as a personal attribute from eternity, okay, and only when it was time to reveal it did He create, okay, those words that simulate the Quran, to haki al-Quran in Jibreel alayhi salam, who in turn revealed them to Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. All right. So what actual attribute of speech do they ascribe to their maker, those who embrace such a doctrine? Okay, that's the problem here. The point is, brothers and sisters, that a mutakallim is not really bound or committed to the tenets of his religion as he would claim to be. The one thing that all mutakallimin are actually committed to by virtue of the very nature of the practice of kalam is the metaphysical theory upon which they establish the existence of the abstract maker they argue for in every debate. Right. They may and would indeed manipulate that theory as needed within limits generally tolerated by the academy, of course, but they would never dare let it go altogether, that theory. Whatever else they choose to commit themselves to in terms of religious creed would only earn that commitment from the immediate society that the mutakallim wishes to cater to or to appease with what he does, to appease with what he does. Which is why the Ash'ira of today are actually closer to the Mu'tazila of old than they are to earlier Ash'ira, okay, from 10 centuries in the past or so. In fact, it can be argued that they share more common beliefs with the philosophers of today than the Mu'tazila of old did with the philosophers of their time. This is so because the real fundamental issue with both sects, Mu'tazila and Ash'ira, is one that has to do with sources of belief, sources of epistemic current, مصادر التلقي المعرفي. Okay, about بشأن الغيب والإلهيات, about the unobservable and the divine. They both take their metaphysical commitments as a premise source, as prime source of belief within their commitments to their social circles, as explained earlier, just like their fellow philosophers do, while claiming that it's only rational necessity, القطع العقلي, they're committed to. All right. This is generally what we mean when we say that they put reason, العقل, prior to scripture, النقل, يقدمون العقل على النقل. Okay, it should ultimately be read actually as putting Greek metaphysical philosophy prior to scripture. تقديم النظر الميتافيزيقي اليوناني نوعا يعني على النقل. Okay, there really is no objective truth in the academic field of philosophy, which includes Western theology and Kalam, by the way, to a philosopher's claim that he holds a particular belief as rationally necessary. Okay, no objective truth to that. As long as he identifies himself as a philosopher, he is socially required to accept the invitation to debate and to propose arguments for whatever he believes, whatever that may be. Okay, and to accept the very idea at any given time that he might be wrong, okay, about anything. If he insists that this or that belief is self-evidently true and that no argumentation could in principle refute it or defeat it, then this is to be considered his own opinion, his own view, and unless he justifies it with some theoretical background or underlying epistemology one way or another, he is only to be considered a blind follower. Okay? المتكلم is no different, brothers and sisters. Even though Mohammed Hijab claims affinity to Ibn Taymiyyah's position with respect to fitra, he refuses to let the point slide without appealing to some propositional evidence to back it up. After all, in the context of the Greek sophistry on which he was trained, nothing is easier than appealing to objective rational necessity. They ask you to provide compelling evidence for X, and all you have to offer in response is insisting that it needs no evidence at all to be seen as the truth because humans have fitra and it tells them that X is true. What would that make of you in the context of Western academic philosophy? What would that leave you? Okay, a feeble-minded follower who is blindly biased to X, whatever it may be. That's it. Okay, you need, according to contemporary philosophy especially, to acquire at least some theory of knowledge that sits comfortably within a metaphysical framework about existence as a whole, that you also embrace if you wish to stand justified in claiming that certain facts are already known to normal healthy humans in what you call fitra. You have to argue for that position propositionally to the best of your capacity if you wish to be taken seriously at any capacity. It is not enough to appeal to some psychological survey where little children are shown to exhibit a general propensity to ascribe all good things in their lives to what you call God, to what you would call God. Obviously, there is the statistic, and there is the interpretation of that statistic, and without arguing effectively for the reason why you would interpret those findings as such, your interpretation would be no better than that of the naturalist who would explain it away in all manners of explanation that fit the naturalistic worldview that he or she embraces. All right? The discipline or the medium where a mutakallim wishes to be recognized with his propositions and arguments would accept no less than that, brothers and sisters. This is, or this in effect, reduces the claim of fitra to little more than a baseless theory, okay? A suggestion. Of course, no philosopher worth his salt, according to the standards of the Academy, would accept a claim that renders him a liar to himself or a sufferer of self-deception, rationalization, and unfit reasoning by virtue of something nobody has ever managed to prove, unquestionably. None of his peers, okay, has ever managed to do that. Which is why many of today's mutakallimin, mostly those with vacuous Salafi affiliations like this guy here, found themselves compelled to follow the prevailing trend in philosophy of knowledge and actually propose some theory of knowledge that includes fitra one way or another, or a reference to it. To the extent that that we now have quite a few of those authors in the Arab world who are involved with addressing atheism and examining atheistic literature, writing about the theory of knowledge, نظرية المعرفة. And some are intent on showing that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah did in fact have a theory of knowledge of his own upon which he built everything he wrote. After all, the general zeitgeist underlying the practice is that you are not justified in any major claim you make until you provide a propositional argument for it, one that plays by the rules, okay, of the trade, one that at least agrees with the prevailing metaphysical paradigm on what the world is made of. Okay, listen to Hijab as he proceeds with his discussion on why we need philosophy, mentioning Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, Ibn Taymiyyah's position with respect to fitra, and why he rejected all claims about the first duty of a mutakallim, أول واجبات المكلفين, being the engagement with kalami theory, أو النظر الكلامي. He says, and I quote, The instinct to believe in God is something which is supra-rational. It's like, as Ibn Taymiyyah himself mentioned, when the baby is born, he has an instinct to suckle the breast of his mother. Now, this is an instinct. You don't need to rationalize that. You don't need to think about that. And to be fair, cognitive behavior science or cognitive science has proven to a great extent that, in fact, we do have that instinct. End quote. But is it not the case that the first duty of a mukallaf should now be to actually establish sufficient evidence for the existence of fitra in himself as a member of the humankind in order to stand justified when philosophers question the reason why he believes the creator or is in the creator or in anything like one? Okay, what would he do if a philosopher showed him that what you call, Brother Hijab, so confidently a scientific proof for the existence of fitra in children actually doesn't justify a person in believing in God, since it does have quite a few naturalistic explanations that sit comfortably within the prevailing worldview under which these very surveys themselves were designed, the Darwinian worldview. Okay, would it then become his duty to learn how to debunk that claim, lest he stands unjustified in his belief that fitra constitutes sufficient reason for him to believe in his maker? I contend that hijab is required by entailment to believe that, to make that the first duty of a mukallaf, which obviously leaves the Sahaba radiallahu anhum again unjustified in their faith thanks to that central entailment that befalls every mutakallim from whatever sect of kalam, as I've explained in previous lectures. Okay, it's remarkable how he proceeds to refer to an earlier lecture where he quoted some author in cognitive science who mentioned Islamic fitra by name in his book, okay, holding that there is evidence for it, and forgets to explain to his audience why, despite that fact, the author has not yet embraced Islam, and it's not even likely that he would. Okay, the reason, brothers and sisters, is that philosophically speaking, this does nothing to prove that we were indeed created by that being we are hardwired to feel compelled or tempted to believe in. They would still qualify it as a leap of faith, unjustifiable faith, to say that the fitrah, no matter how evident they are willing to view it to be, suffices in knowing that God actually exists, with no need to practice any form of theorization, neither to acquire that knowledge. Okay, our position, Brother Hijab, and that of Ibn Taymiyyah, is not just that instinct exists, is that it provides irrefutable knowledge in the subject matter, knowledge that is sufficient. Okay, that is epistemically sufficient, warranted. Knowledge that does not call for proposition or argumentation of any form. Okay. We know by that instinct that we have a creator worthy of our ultimate praise and submission, just as well as we know that we have indeed experienced the past events as we remember them, or that we do exist in this world as we observe it. Our instinctive identification of that ultimate agency is not some Darwinian mechanism for survival that has evolved in humans in an early epoch of their proclaimed evolution. It's readily justified. It's a readily justified or super-rational, to use Hijab's own words, piece of knowledge that defeats the very grounds upon which the theory of evolution itself was founded. A healthy, mentally fit human being should not only admit to that knowledge, but refrain from theorizing in contrast to it. Okay, in contrast with it. He says, it's true that babies are born believing in a higher power, that's the truth, and they don't require any evidence for this at all. Just like a child does not require any evidence to know where to suck a breast, or we don't need any evidence to know that a candle put in a person's hand would cause them pain. In a straightforward sense, you can argue that we don't need any arguments for the existence of God, that believing in God is something which is super-rational, which comes like that. But we can't say to someone who's inquiring, okay, that just because we have an instinct to believe in God, therefore God exists, because that is a fallacy in itself, the naturalistic fallacy. Okay, that's not a demonstrative way to prove God's existence. We can just end there. We can say we don't need to prove God's existence, but because why would we need to prove God's existence when we already have an instinct for it, just like we have an instinct for X, Y, and Z? It's an intuition. We intuit this feeling of belief in God, but some people do need that. End quote. He then proceeds to quote Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah in one of the most famous quotations that is appealed to by this new hybrid sect of Salafi mutakallimin, which we've shown at length in previous lectures, their profound methodological fallacy in taking as evidence that the practice of kalam is indeed the way of Ibn Taymiyyah and the way of the Salaf radallahu anhum. Now, look at how contradictory this statement we just quoted really is. Now, we can see that he does realize that as a mutakallim, he is not justified in simply asserting that we have that instinct, as cognitive scientists would call it. Of course, philosophers would not accept such an assertion as sufficient justification for the ultimate foundation of Islamic faith. Of course they wouldn't. But here's where the fundamental distinction between the way of the Salaf and Ibn Taymiyyah on their track and the way of the Khalaf on the other hand comes forth. A Salafi, brothers and sisters, would take such an inquirer, as he calls him, who doesn't admit that he knows he has been created and is being sustained, as a case of socio-psychological malady, a case of hawa, okay, where a sick mind appeals to all kinds, sick mind and a bad heart appeals to all kinds of fallacies and false argumentations to justify its position in a textbook case of rationalization. All right. His job would then be to show that the sheer embarrassing falsity of any excuse he might have to turn his back on the call of his fitrah and to warn him of the fate he will face if he dies as such. It is in this context, the context of debunking and refuting those excuses and rationalizations he may have, that we should place Ibn Taymiyyah's assertion that some people would feel more comfortable when dressed with long, sophisticated arguments, as would generally feature in the discourse of mutakallimin and philosophers, and would commonly be found there in such literature. Of course, a Salafi scholar would resort to philosophical terms and arguments that are common in philosophical discourse to do that, okay, naturally. And that's exactly what we've seen Ibn Taymiyyah do in refuting the innovations of mutakallimin in his books. It's what I have been doing in my books and my lectures for years, actually. A Khalafi, on the other hand, would say it is indeed a sheer fallacy to think that just because people feel inclined to believe in a higher power, then such power does in fact exist. So when someone claims that they don't know that they were indeed created or have no reason to know that, then we should address them with the kind of propositional argument that they require, whatever that may be, in attempt to establish the knowledge that some maker does exist, some abstract entity that acquires its attributes from the metaphysical theory upon which its existence was founded, argumentatively. Okay? In the context of doing that, we might, the Khalafi would say, find need to refute some false beliefs, theories, or references that they have, that our opponent has, but the central job of the da'iyah would be to establish that position, that positive demonstrative argument, and propose it in the inquirer's hand as the way to establish knowledge of the existence of a creator, as the reason to believe that one does exist, like the mutakallimin did when they chose to employ the metaphysics of their time as premise in their arguments. So what is wrong with doing that? What is wrong with doing that, brothers and sisters? Well, first and foremost, the very assumption that someone would need a propositional argument to know that they were in fact created by someone and would be treated as intellectually honest in claiming that they find no such knowledge readily available is false and categorically unacceptable. That claim is false and categorically unacceptable. If indeed you do believe that fitrah constitutes sufficient knowledge of the existence of our Maker, knowledge that needs no justification, then obviously those who don't see it that way should only be treated as insane or mentally incompetent, okay, or something that to that effect. Pretty much as we would treat someone who has lost any other instinct, or who claims they don't know, for example, that the world is real around them, or that other minds do exist, or that the past events did in fact happen, etc. Why would someone who claims that they have no reason to believe that the world and the people around him are real, a solipsist, be treated as mentally ill, whereas someone who believes he has no reason to believe that he was indeed created, okay, be treated any different? Be treated otherwise, okay? The reason is purely socio-cultural, brothers and sisters, because the Western world has been brought up intellectually and culturally throughout the centuries on the values of the Greek Academy. If the belief is harmless to the society, then those who embrace it are not to be judged mentally and unfit. And since nobody will get hurt, if someone decides to become an atheist, or so they think anyway, then that's just an opinion that could either be justified like any other opinion or not in terms of propositional arguments, of course, in a debate. In which case, it would simply be a wrong opinion. You're entitled to view it to be wrong, but that's all that you're entitled to do. Okay, with respect to it. Unlike someone who believes you and I are just figments of his imagination. Okay, what if he decides it's okay to kill us, for example, since we're all an illusion in his mind anyway? That would be bad for us, of course, obviously. So he can't be, as such, treated as a normal, safe member of our community. Thus, his condition should merit a definition as a psychological disorder or psychopathy or something of the sort. Okay, otherwise it's okay. Okay, thus we would be compelled to treat him as sick. Otherwise, let them believe whatever they wish. That's all right, as long as they don't hurt us. If it's of no discernible harm to anyone, then no social necessity arises to eliminate such a belief from society or to define it as a sickness. Okay? In truth, however, it is the greatest sophistry anyone has ever committed to claim that they don't have sufficient reason to believe that they were created at all, or to owe anything to a higher being above themselves. Okay? And is by all means the biggest crime against humanity ever committed to let such a claim or opposition become a respectable opinion that requires propositional arguments to counter it. Right? The day it became mainstream thought that there is a burden of the deductive proof upon those who believe they were created and are being sustained is the day the greatest crime against human reason was ever committed. Okay? So the Salafi approach to people who claim they do not have sufficient reasons to believe that they were created is not to propose some theoretical reason per the request. Okay. Rather, we should show them, in such cases where it appears more likely that they would listen than not, how appallingly false and self-destructive that choice of belief on their part really is. We should seek to demolish and ridicule every theoretical backing they claim to have for doubt or disbelief, or for thinking that they do not know that they were created. The only reasonably sound approach by someone who truly believes in that instinctive knowledge we call fitrah, and in its epistemic worth and epistemic merit, or warrant, okay, to helping people with such disfigured hearts and polluted minds is to try to cure their hearts from hawa and free their minds from those fallacies by which they rationalize their skepticism to themselves, not to provide them with arguments that propose founding their belief in their maker upon such theories that were in fact the very reason why they ended up suffering from that skepticism in the first place. Okay, there's a psychological and sociological reason why most of those atheists who decide to embrace Islam at some point in the wake of such arguments and debates by the Mutakallimin and Christian apologists that is, end up reverting to atheism eventually, sometimes even repeatedly, as the reality of the online forums and pages where atheists come to debate with Muslims or Christians would show you. I mean, I distinctively remember a case where one particular individual called himself in his account name in one of these forums. He called himself Muslim on and off. Muslim on and off. What is that? That's the miserable state that he was in at the time. Okay, he kept getting in and out of Islam like he was putting on some clothes and taking them off, just as easy as that. Okay, that's what that was all. That's what that practice was doing to them. Okay, there's a psychological and sociological reason for that, brothers and sisters, and we need to understand it properly. Okay, and it has to do with the hawa of kalam. It's the kalam method actually is creating that sociological and psychological environment. The fundamental problem here, brothers and sisters, is not that those they engaged with were incompetent debaters, as any adept mutakallim would propose, would have you believe. The problem is that the very mode of discourse that defines the practice of kalam is methodologically flawed, methodologically false. Okay? It characterizes people with such doubts as people who just don't know what needs to be known in order to acquire proper faith, rather than as people who are inflicted with deep-seated ahwa, bad inclinations of the heart, and layers upon layers of false doctrine and social convention by which they rationalize such a miserable condition to themselves. I can't begin to count the times in which I've seen the term truth seeker being given irresponsibly to people who are by no means willing to ever see the clear truth for what it really is. This is, as I elaborated in other material and shall proceed to reiterate here, inshallah, is the foundation of irja' in mutakallimin, brothers and sisters. It's why they redefined Iman in the innovative manner that they did. After all, when you spend years literally arguing and debating some atheist, jumping him across the different colors of the atheistic spectrum back and forth, from the strong atheist to the weak agnostic and whatever is in between and around these two positions, and then finally, for some psychosocial reason you would almost definitely fail to recognize, he declares that he thinks the world must have had, in fact, a maker. Not only would you view that as a triumph then, you would even want people to actually acknowledge it as such, as a mutakallim, in some twisted measure of self-validation, that is. Finally, at long last, you managed to build an argument that convinced him. Okay, that convinced him. You'd say that if he had finally chosen to convert, okay, to Islam, then I did convince him. Okay, that's what it looks like now, doesn't it? Okay, you would thus haste to render your achievement as shifting a truth seeker from disbelief to belief. And thus, it is no surprise that gradually your definition of Iman, حد الإيمان عندك, would decay to the point where it becomes little more than belief in the existence of the Maker, التصديق بوجود الصانع, which is how early Jahmiyyah and Mu'tazila defined it. Whatever that Maker really is, even if it's little more than the deistic Maker embraced by many philosophers, as a matter of fact. This demolition of the scholarly definition of Iman in Islam is a direct consequence of the Greek approach to reason and sophistry, and the way they sought to acquire knowledge of the unobservable and of the divine. It's a consequence of that. The very approach that spawned simultaneously the Western Academy of Philosophy on one hand and the practice of Kalam on the other. That shifting and turning from one belief system to another, characteristic of philosophers and consequently of mutakallimin and theologians, of course, is never actually an outcome of acquiring sufficient arguments or of conviction in its purely theoretical sense, no matter how much it may look like that in many cases. It's purely the outcome of a change in heartly inclination. However, argue all you want for position X with a philosophically well-versed opponent with opposing position Y, who embraces the opposing position Y, they will never shift to X unless there happens to arise some shift in sociological conditions that leaves him in more trouble and distress, socially speaking, if he chooses to stick to position Y than if he chooses to shift to X, or that leaves him in far more favorable social conditions if he chooses to shift to X than if he chooses to stick to Y, right? His conscious mind would typically not realize that his newfound conviction with arguments for X is actually not due to a better comprehension of those arguments than before, but rather due to a new subconscious inclination to X that was not there before. Okay, which is why, by the way, in Islam it is not permissible for Muslims to become friends and to let themselves feel emotional affinity and friendship and attachment to people who are who declare themselves to be mubtada', people of bid'ah, people of innovation, okay, people who propagate those innovations, because at some point, eventually, your heart would be inclined to accept what they're saying. Your heart would be inclined to feel that, due to sympathizing with them, due to the empathy you feel towards them, you would start to sympathize with what they think, because naturally, you instinctually find yourself compelled you want to be in accord with what these people believe, with what people who are closest to you believe. You want to agree with, you wish deeply to, emotionally speaking, and in the subconscious of your mind, you wish to agree to have yourself in perfect accord with those who are closest to you. Okay, that's an instinct in human beings. All right. So if this is the case, and if in fact the sociological pressures and the sociological context in which you live changes, then you should take care of your heart and what will happen to it, because sometimes it may it may in fact shift you into accepting things that you didn't accept before, not by merit of argument or not by merit of evidence at all, but by merit of how you feel towards the people who embrace those different opinions, those opposing or different opinions. Okay, so if you wish to examine the validity of this claim, ask anyone you know who was once a self-proclaimed strong atheist and is now taking the position of an agnostic. Okay, for example, why he had that shift, why he had that change of mind. If he says it's because he found that what he once took as evidence for the non-existence of a creator actually turned out not to be evidence at all, as he once thought, which is what we'd probably say anyway, then ask him why he chose to accept their refutation now, despite the fact that at some point in the past he might have been inclined to reject those refutations wholesale without even bothering to contemplate them or to look at them at all, or to look them up, and despite the fact that he knows that if he were to do but a little research now, he would surely find an abundance of atheistic defenses of those arguments and philosophical responses to those refutations of all levels of sophistication his heart would desire. Okay, so the real reason, brothers and sisters, for that shift would by no means be that he finally found arguments that cannot be refuted philosophically. The real reason would be that he now desires to believe that those arguments cannot be refuted. He desires to believe that. Now his heart is in the place of wishing to believe this, of wishing to accept that. Okay? His heart has shifted to a condition where he wishes to show his immediate society, the ones that are closest to him, that he has finally accepted the agnostic position rather than his previous strong atheistic position, and that he is doing this because he is following the evidence, okay, honestly, wherever it takes him. Okay, so his subconscious mind lets him embrace those arguments as valid and sufficient arguments for the agnostic position, despite the clear fact that the only properly rational alternative to atheism is believing in a creator, not agnosticism, in fact. Since it's the atheist who's constantly asking you to challenge the overwhelmingly clear mastery of creation and perfection of order permeating every aspect of this world around you, to the extent of someone like Richard Dawkins literally asking his followers to bite their tongues every time they say design or designed, in describing the way that different biological systems work in fulfillment of their function, and instead use the word designoid or anything to that effect. Is the atheist who is constantly trying to come up with a nihilistic explanation of the overwhelmingly clear perfection of order in every corner of this world. So to finally reject atheism is to return to the otherwise obvious intuitive position. And yet many would insist that they are in fact truth seekers just because they've chosen to become agnostic rather than atheist. Okay, they declare themselves to be that. Now, the problem with the method of Kalam, brothers and sisters, is that a mutakallim would explain that shift I just described as the outcome of new knowledge that wasn't there before. He now knows better, and perhaps in time he will know even better still, and finally shift to believe in the Maker, or theism as the mutakallim would loosely call it. Okay. Nothing could be further away from the truth, though, about what's actually going on in the mind and heart of such a proclaimed truth seeker. It's not a question of knowledge at all, brothers and sisters. The default attitude would be that he is and will continue to be a truth seeker for as long as he is still keen on engaging in more and more of those debates. That's what the mutakallim would think. So where does that attitude come from? Okay, it comes from the Greek scholastic tradition that teaches that propositional argumentation and theoretical debate is the only route, the only way to distinguish truth from fallacy and knowledge from sophistry, and the only way to address those who claim they don't see the truth for what it is. The Greek tradition taught that it is categorically wrong and unacceptable to tempt people, targhib al-nas, or intimidate them, tarhibhim, into accepting a certain belief, any belief, rather than provide arguments for its validity, propositional arguments, rather than merely propose yourself to be true, to be telling the truth. Because it taught people that all beliefs are equal, at least potentially, in requiring arguments, propositional arguments, in the eyes of some people, perfectly sane and psychologically fit people, to be established as truth. Or in other words, it taught relativity of necessity, brothers and sisters, absolute relativity of necessity, as an inherent metaphysical property in all of knowledge. All articles of knowledge are to be considered only relatively necessary. Okay? If it's a knowledge claim, any claim, then by definition, by that metaphysical position, it should be such that some sane people may see enough reasons to accept it, while others, who are actually also sane, equally sane, may not. Okay, and so If you don't see this or that belief as truth, no matter how many arguments for it you've examined or come by, then by no means are you to be blamed. There by no means are you to be blamed or berated for such an attitude. Okay, or belittled. This is why certain sects of extreme Mu'tazilites, الغلاة المعتزلة, like الجاحظية for example, actually believed that an atheist might be pardoned in the afterlife for choosing to die on the Day of Judgment, for choosing to die as an atheist despite being subjected to all the arguments there can be for the validity of Islam. Why? Because they could be honest and telling the truth when they claim that none of that was enough to convince them. That, of course, is a blasphemous level of irja'. But the point here that I'm trying to make is in understanding why such a position emerged at all in the first place among Mutakallimin and Islamic philosophers. Because according to the Greek scholastic tradition, there is no such thing as a final argument. حجة نهائية. Okay, no matter how well you present your case, whatever its subject matter may be, there will always be people who don't find it sufficient, who think that your claim to truth is not sufficiently justified. Those people should never be treated as liars to themselves or as victims of cognitive dissonance or of hawa, as long as they claim to have some rational objections against your case or opposing arguments of their own that they can actually debate you with. As such, it would be your duty to engage with them in debate as peers and let it last for as long as it will, if you wish to convince them that debate. Okay. Otherwise, no talk of what dark fate would befall those who choose not to believe, or what prize would be given to those who do choose to believe, because that would be like threatening someone to accept an argument he truly and honestly does not think it works. Okay, and of course, if indeed such was the case with the belief that the Creator exists, and that the message of Tawheed is in fact His final testament to the world, then of course it would be immoral and unacceptable to threaten people who insist on rejecting it by an eternal punishment in the afterlife if they die as such. But clearly, it is not the case. Clearly, it is not the case. We are not preaching unto people to embrace some questionable theory that some philosopher had invented for us, brothers and sisters. We are not asking them to take the theoretical opinion of a human individual like themselves, as though it were an objectively undefeatable truth. We're calling unto them to listen to an invitation that is fully justified by the knowledge they find in their fitrah, to submit to what they should be able to know is the truth just by listening to it stated in their own language. If, however, they claim they don't see enough reasons to believe it, then we find them treated in the Quran not as ignorants who need to acquire sufficient arguments to help them establish the knowledge upon which the prophetic argument or al-Hujjah Risaliyah is built, but as sick people who are inflicted with total submission to hawa, ibadat al-hawa. That is, their innate reason and intuition tells them that this can only be the truth, mostly subconsciously, and yet they insist on rationalizing it away in favor of some social condition they currently enjoy, and they know they would probably lose it if they were to submit themselves to that invitation. Because they suffer from hawa, from bad psychological inclinations, they would make up all kinds of fallacies to rationalize their false beliefs and reduce the sense of cognitive dissonance they suffer, and to get out of that feeling, that bad feeling. Such fallacies would then be presented in the form of philosophical arguments that they insist are irrefutable, of course. So to engage with those fallacies in the same manner in which we engage with some theoretical suggestion that may in fact turn out to be true is to commit a categorical error of method that nowhere in the Quran or in the Sunnah would we find an example of. They should, of course, be refuted as needed, those false beliefs, but not in favor of some philosophical argument that seeks to establish the truth upon some metaphysical myth that they embrace, to establish Islamic beliefs upon that, not in an attempt to give them the knowledge they claim they don't already have in the manner they claim that they need, because we know they already have it inside them, hardwired in their hearts. Okay, what needs to be done is to remove all the layers of falsity that have stifled it. Okay, it should be done in a context of lamentation. It should thus be done in a context of lamentation, التبكيت والتشنيع, and warning and nidara against insisting on submitting themselves to that hawa as we find in the Quran. That's exactly what we find in the book. Naturally, however, even in such a context, it would be futile to address them with refutational arguments that don't match up with the level of depth and sophistication they have reached in arguing for the false beliefs they have accumulated for themselves over the years. Which is why Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah would teach in that single most misquoted part of his book Debunking the Logicians, Radd al-Mantiqiyin, that some people get more benefit from an argument the more sophisticated its premises are, because their minds have been so deeply drowned in that stuff. It's wrong to even expect them to listen to you or what you have to say in refutation of their sophisticated arguments if your refutations themselves are not up to par. That, of course, would be true in case that the hawa, that the subject of da'wah suffers, is not keeping them from even bothering to listen to what you have to say at all. Which means that not all cases would require the same level of lamentation and blame or the same degree of sophistication and detail in the refutational arguments. Okay, if they are to be addressed at all, that is. This, I argue, is the only proper way to understand what Ibn Taymiyyah was stating in that quotation. The only understanding that actually fits with the Salafi creed and the Salafi stance on Kalam and the Kalam method that we know he ascribes to, and we've only ever seen him championing in his books, rahimahullah. If indeed it is the case that Ibn Taymiyyah is actually encouraging Muslims to use the method of Kalam in building propositional arguments for the existence of an abstract maker upon the prevailing metaphysical theory about existence in principle, or about the world in particular, as Hijab and his friends would insist, then he would have suffered from a fundamental contradiction of method for A, insisting that we don't need to acquire any such arguments at all because we have fitrah, and B, denouncing the doctrine of wujub al-nadhar, okay, that we discussed earlier. If it is the case that we already know by fitrah that we've been created by the only being worthy of worship, then it is either the case that this knowledge is objectively sufficient for our faith in the validity of Islam to be built properly and securely, or it is not. If it is, then nobody should need to come up with such an argument, and the very idea of doing that, resorting to another, should qualify as sophistry and tanattu'. Okay, if not, then how were the Sahaba themselves justified in embracing the faith as strongly and confidently as they did, to the extent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praising them for it in the Quran in more places than one, when we know for a fact they never even considered coming up with such arguments at all, or ever had anything to do with metaphysics and its methods. So the only plausible position that is free from self-contradiction for someone who proclaims to agree with Ahlul Hadith on attacking the innovation of wujub al-nadhar and of this dismissing fitrah is to dismiss the entire enterprise of Kalam, okay, defined as such, as we previously mentioned, as a major methodological innovation, which is indeed what we know is both the stance of the Salaf and of Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, on Kalam in general. Anyone who has ever read his criticism of Burhan al-Huduth, the cosmological argument alone, should be able to see that stance as clear as day. All mutakallimin suffer from the innovation of wujub al-nadhar hadi, one way or another. If not by clear statement at-tasrih, then by entailment bil-iqtida'. The idea that some people may need metaphysical arguments to know that their maker exists entails that fitrah is actually lacking in some people, which in turn lacking altogether. Which in turn implies that the methods of the prophets and the Quran were never enough to build the prophetic argument al-Hujja Risaliyya, because it could easily be the case that some people may not have found what they heard from the prophet to be sufficient in this respect, and thus it had to be the case that they all be obliged by law to engage with nadhar and study kalam, such that nobody would have any excuse on the day of judgment for not finding sufficient reasons to believe in the validity of Islam. Okay? In other words, either Kalam argumentation is necessary for at least some people to have sufficient reasons to believe that Islam is the truth, or it is not. If it is, then the prophetic argument is incomplete, because the Prophet ﷺ never knew Kalam or taught it to his followers, to his disciples, much less make it wajib to at least some people to do that. If not, then Kalam is nothing but a major innovation. Either the messenger built his da'wah upon sufficient reasons for all people to believe it to be true in terms of epistemic warrant, or he did not, in which case Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be contradicted in saying in the Quran, رُسُلًا مُبَشِّرِينَ وَمُنذِرِينَ لِأَلَّا يَكُونَ لِلنَّاسِ عَلَى اللَّهِ حُجَّةٌ بَعْدَ الرُّسُلِ لِأَلَّا يَكُونَ لِلنَّاسِ عَلَى اللَّهِ حُجَّةٌ بَعْدَ الرُّسُلِ. messages of glad tidings and of warning, in order that mankind might have no argument against Allah after the messengers on the day of judgment. That translation. Now, the Ash'ari were well aware of this inescapable entailment for their position on this issue, and they tried to escape it by claiming that the Sahaba radiallahu anhu and the Salaf in general did in fact engage in nadar, although not in the metaphysical methods adopted by mutakallimin. Yani. They fail, however, to see that this takes them nowhere, actually, since apart from the obvious fact that nowhere in their legacy is there any trace of such nadar, الصحابة في أثر الصحابة لا تجد هذا النظر, much less of the claim that they all engaged with it in one way or another, and that they found it to be the first duty of a mukallaf, apart from the fact that which suffices to defeat that defense. Apart from that fact which suffices to defeat the defense, it is also obvious that they never knew the theory of substances and essences. Okay, نظرية الجوهر والعرض. They never employed metaphysical argumentation of any kind. التنظير على شرط الوجود والإطلاق وهذه الأشياء. So either the methods of nadar they employed on the assumption that they did it all were sufficient in proving epistemic warrant for praiseworthy faith, in which case the entire enterprise of Kalam would still be rendered as an innovation, or they would not, which implies contradicting the Quran. Okay? The point is, you cannot embrace the method of Kalam and yet proclaim to embrace Fitra as a readily justified source of knowledge on the matter, and to reject the innovation of Wajib al-Nadar as the Imams of Ahl Sunnah have conceded to, without suffering a major contradiction, methodological contradiction. Okay, تناقض منهجي. There is a reason why the mutakallimun of old rejected fitra, a reason that hijab is yet incapable of comprehending, brothers and sisters. He proceeds to say, and I quote, Ibn Taymiyyah interestingly says the following, and I'm taking this from his book Al-Radd al-Mantiqiyin, or a reply to Aristotelian logic, let's call it. Al-Mantiqiyin, he is talking particularly about Aristotelian logic. And it's translated, by the way, by Al-Halaq, a Christian Arab. Ibn Taymiyyah says the following. Some people, every time the proof is more explicated and detailed with more logical premises, it's more useful to them. And with this kind of person, one should use a detailed kalam approach or any other such analytic approach which they would be used to. So here Ibn Taymiyyah is saying, actually, you should use this approach. Now, I did a trick one time. I put it out once and said one of my shuyukh, Al-Sheikh Ahmed, he said this. And I translated it just like this, put it on Twitter, and some people from, the far-right Salafist Madkhalit movement started attacking this quote from the Sheikh, said, look at this, it's a mubtada'. This person is a dal mudil. This person is a deviant, and so on. Who is this Sheikh Ahmed anyway? Okay, we need to know who he takes knowledge from. Has he taken it from Sheikh Rabi' al-Madkhali or laughing, okay, and so on. And they kept going, and I just let them keep going, and then I revealed his full name is, Sheikh Ahmed ibn Taymiyyah, basically. Full name is this. So it was like, it was a bit of an embarrassment for them. Some of them knew who it was in the first place, but this is a definitive proof that Ibn Taymiyyah's position was not that you cannot use philosophy. It's a definitive proof. And by the way, there are so many of these quotes. This is, for me, the clearest one. If you want, I can get a hold of, because it's important to start with this preamble, end quote. Now, first of all, his attempt to reduce the book into a criticism of just the Aristotelian logic in particular, Kitab Radd al-Mantiqiyin, rather than the entire enterprise of logical theory in its principle, or the notion of making up rules for thinking properly, is not something we're thinking properly. بهذا الإطلاق, thinking, and the very meaning of how to think properly, okay, is to be achieved through these methods. That's what logic is about. Okay, now this attempt on his part is not to be passed without a comment. If indeed he did read the book in its entirety, that book he's referring to, then he would know that the Imam was opposed to the very idea of attempting to theorize rules and definitions, hudud mantiqiyya, the way Aristotle and his followers did, and every other logician ever since has been doing. Not just to the rules that Aristotle himself came up with. Okay? المنطق المشائي. It's not just about the mantiq of the Aristotelians alone. Many people would claim that Ibn Taymiyyah wrote this book as a contribution to logic, in attempt to fix it or to show where it went wrong so that logicians afterwards would perfect their craft and do a better job with it. No, this is absolutely false, brothers and sisters. A mischaracterization of what he was doing, what he did for. And you can tell that it is a false, it's a false claim even from the very title of the book. Okay, now he called it الرد على المناطق, answering the logicians. That is refuting and debunking what the logicians do in his very principle, which is what he actually did in the book. Okay, he didn't call it إصلاح المنطق, for example, fixing logic, or تطهير المنطق, clarifying it, or توجيه المنطق, guiding logicians or something of the sort. No. There are long passages where he openly declares that logic, in the very principle of what it is not needed by the smart and not helpful to the stupid. Okay? That's an attack against the very foundation of any discipline that the philosophers would call logic as such, not just the rules of Aristotle. What Hijab and others like him failed to see is that this book was only written as part of the Imam's jihad against mutakallimin. It was written to literally pull the rug from under the feet of mutakallimin whenever a mutakallim seeks to publicize his innovations under the claim that it was his reliance on the science of logic in thinking and argumentation that led him to such sound deductions and irrefutable beliefs. And if he claims that قطع العقل, or the necessities of the mind that he proclaims are the outcome of logical thinking, then okay. Let's show you what your logical thinking really is, and what it's really like. Okay, let's show that they don't actually have solid grounds to stand upon when they rely on this on these theories of the Greeks. Okay, so that's what the book was about. That's what the book was written for. All right, and anybody who has been brought up on the true Salafi creed would easily see that to be the case, and would understand that the book is what the book is generally about, what it was written for, even if you only ever read but a few passages or excerpts from the book. But then again, this is someone who never really was a Salafi to begin with. Okay. Second of all, look at that shameful, childish way in which he so happily and merrily admits to have played with the aforementioned quotation from the book. Of course, if you cut the quotation out of its context, translated it like you did, and put it forth among students of Sunnah on Twitter, they would judge it as dalal, of course, and would even take it as evidence that the author of whom they were left unaware is a mutakallim who explicitly promotes the method of kalam that was condemned by the Salaf. You can do that with the text of any other Imam, by the way, not just Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, yani. Okay, this is not an innovation of Sheikh Rabi', by the way, in Tabdi' that they only took from him. Okay, that response that you found from those Salafis is not Sheikh Rabi''s bid'ah. This is the way the Salaf and the Imams of the Salaf, rahimahumullah, would follow. It's the way of the Salaf, to judge people according to what they know, to judge people according to what we know about them. Okay. It was the Salaf to whom you ascribe yourself and to whom we ascribe Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, despite your ignorance of his ways, who condemned kalam, the method and the practice itself, in no uncertain terms. It was the Salaf radiallahu anhum who taught us to go to our akabir, okay, to go to the akabir, the major scholars of Islam, of Sunnah, to ask them about taking knowledge from people we do not know. And it is the Salaf who taught us not to cut out portions of the words of a certain Imam in some of his books and put them forth in such a way as to lead people to attack them with a charge he does not really deserve, that Imam, just to make fun of a group of people who ascribe themselves to that Imam. Okay, so if anything, this silly joke renders you a liar, a manipulator, and an ignorant of the actual creed to which your proclaimed Shaykh belongs, Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, and a clown making a fool of himself at best. Okay, there is no way on earth that you and those whoever behaves like you are to really be considered students of the Shaykh rahimahullah. Yani he's not your Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, and you're not his student. So the joke is on you, brother, not on those Salafis who faulted you and you proclaimed anonymous Shaykh who they thought had written those words. The joke is on you. Now, third of all, This dramatic assertion that this quotation is so happy with is a definitive proof that Ibn Taymiyyah's position was not that you cannot use philosophy or that you can become a mutakallim when the need arises, only shows his ignorance when it comes to the actual way of the Salaf and to understanding what Ibn Taymiyyah was really teaching in that book and in the rest of his books. His bold claim that this is but one of many passages in the Imam's book that do confirm his innovative position is nothing but a giant soap bubble. And I've shown in a previous lecture dedicated to that issue and in another longer and more elaborate one in my Arabic lectures how much of a criminal offense against the Shaykh and his legacy this claim really is. This miserable condition in which this fellow puts himself, brothers and sisters, is the inevitable outcome of reading the books of the Imam rahimahullah without sufficient qualification. And by qualification, I mean essentially, and please pay attention here, and by way of priority, knowledge and comprehension of the true ways of the Salaf with respect to Kalam. Okay? And what exactly they meant when they declared their unanimous condemnation of the practice of Kalam, which is something that would never happen to someone who was never really a student of true scholars of Ahl Sunnah in the first place. Okay? You should never expect that to be found in someone like Hijab and his friends. Such books are really not to be made accessible to such preachers at all in the first place. If there ever was a way to keep them from even reading these books at all, then by all means that's what we should be doing. That's what should be done. Okay, to cut their access to these books. To the books of Ibn Taymiyyah رحمه الله. قال ابن مسعود رضي الله عنه إنك لست محدثا قوما بحديث لا تبلغه عقولهم إلا كان فيه فتنة لبعضهم. Ibn Mas'ud is narrated to have said, you won't address people with something they are not qualified to comprehend and not cause them fitna. Imam Bukhari رحمه الله بوّب بابا, he subtitled a part of his book Sahih al-Jami' saying باب من خص بالعلم قوما دون قوم كراهية ألا يفهموا. A chapter on keeping some parts of science exclusive to some people rather than others, lest they would fail to comprehend it. The Prophet ﷺ taught one of his companions, Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu, that whoever meets the Lord on pure tawheed, then Allah had vowed not to torture them at all. And when he asked him whether he should declare it to people to give them glad tidings, he said no, lest they quit working. لا تبشرهم فيتكلوا. Meaning that only if they have proper knowledge should they be told about that, okay, lest they misunderstand it. This is why most of the scholars of the KSA of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia do not encourage their students to read some of the Imam's book. They do not encourage them to do that on their own, because unless they wish to specialize in refuting those particular theories and doctrines he wrote these books to refute, they don't need to do that. Okay, they might even get harmed by parts of those books if they read them with little qualification. If indeed they needed to read them at all, then they should be qualified both in terms of comprehension of the Salafi creed and comprehension of the terms and concepts that the Imam addressed in those books, not to mention a particular talent in acquiring a deep understanding of the common foundations and sources of a multitude of doctrines and beliefs as expressed in the texts of their proponents. And I dare say that this fellow here is severely lacking on all these counts, not just with respect to the true Salafi creed, which he doesn't understand. He is to me a perfect example of what happens when underqualified readers set themselves up to read the Imam's book and comment on them. Wallahu musta'an, wala hawla wala quwwata